I'm going to make a small intro section to go over some setup. If you just want to see the games, you can skip to the time code or use the chapters. So for this list, the criteria I'm going with is as follows. Only games that I played myself will be considered. It's just easier that way, especially since I can justify them better. I didn't play everything that came out, and I'm not speaking for the industry as a whole. These are my favorite games of the year, and I'll be trying to explain them from that perspective. If I miss anything that seems ridiculous or obvious, I probably just didn't play it. Most of what I played this year isn't from 2022, which is unfortunate because there were some pretty amazing games I'd like to talk about, but can't figure out how to put them in their own structured thing. Other than that, the hierarchy is not strictly descending. I consider the top 3 as my games of the year, with numbers 10 through 4 as the first runner-ups and the honorable mentions as second runner-up. The numbering scheme is mostly for presentation purposes. I would like to acknowledge a few games that will not be on the list, so why mention them at all? The general discussion I've seen around them makes me think I might have considered them if I had played them. The first is Sifu. I got it on sale recently on Epic but haven't started it yet. Thymesia or Themisia is a game that I really like the look of but have not had the chance to check out. Still Rising is the latest game from Spider Studio. I play most of their games. In fact, I've played all of them since Bound by Flame, and I will play this one as well eventually. It's been getting better praise than all the others, so looking forward to that. Horizon Forbidden West and God of War Ragnarok. I'm choosing to wait for the PC versions of these ones because we now basically have confirmation that all these Sony exclusives will eventually come to PC, so I don't really need to pick them up now and I'm not in a rush. And finally, I generally gravitate towards indie games over AAA games, although I don't think that's much of an issue because we don't have many AAA games that have released this year. I think there's about 7. So unless you have all the consoles like Nintendo and PS5 and PC, you probably won't have a lot of AAA games to pick from this year. So with that being said, these are my top 10 favorite games for 2022. Number 10 is Yugi-oh Masterduel. This is the second card battle game I've tried since Hearthstone back in the day. You unlock cards, build decks, and fight opponents, either online or AI. I'll be honest, when it comes to deck building and the vast collection of Yu-Gi-Oh monsters, traps, and spells, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. There's a lot of terms I don't understand, and some of these cards have so much text that I just give up on reading them. But I am having a great time, which should say something about the game. Whenever I face an opponent of my inexperienced level, it can actually be very fun to try and outplay them. With many of the more experienced players, it's basically just a face stomp all the time. I'll never be great or competent at Yu-Gi-Oh, but the music, presentation, and the desire to improve my beginner deck were enough to keep me returning to the game for another match from time to time. The OST is fantastic with this game. It's basically too epic for what's going on the screen. It's actually kind of ridiculous. Fun fact, some opponents' turns take so long in this game that I sometimes go to refill my tea or check my messages in the meantime, and it takes someone that long to end their turn. I've actually seen people say that they just surrender the game out of frustration with just waiting for someone to complete their turn. That's funny to me. I know some people would hate it, but yeah, that's Yu-Gi-Oh! Number 9 is Nobody Saves the World. While it is slow at the beginning, this one really picks up and can become very addictive if you stick with it. The story is not the most groundbreaking thing, mostly acting as a comedic excuse to have you sent from dungeon to dungeon. But both that and the side quests are quite funny due to the absurdist comedy that is employed through most of them. The lead character's appearance, inability to speak, and lack of eyeballs is used to good effect by the writers in a lot of scenarios. Now, while the art style also has a certain appeal, especially if you like that hand-drawn cartoony style, the primary appeal of the game is definitely the distinct variety of the forms you can take. The game allows a lot of experimentation, as outside of specific puzzle elements and enemies, you can basically use the forms as and when you wish, with the ability to switch between them on the fly. Each form plays differently, requiring differences in how you utilize spacing, managed enemy placement and distance, and even how you handle the controller. So Outside of specific puzzle elements, these forms are basically all valid and can take on most of the content throughout the game, albeit some being harder than others. The experimentation and the large amount of unlocks is enough to keep up the amusement factor throughout this whole experience. Number 8 is Multiversus. Now, since its release, Multiversus has taken over as my main free-to-play platform fighter, overthrowing Brawlhalla, which I've played for years at this point, due to the better production values and the nostalgia baiting of some of my favorite fictional characters. The fact is, having this collection of fighters and licenses just makes the game that much more appealing for a 90s kid. This is yet another game where the simplicity is the charm to me. You can take it as seriously as you wish, learning the intricate and more complex characters and ways to manipulate opponents and climb up the leaderboards. I personally prefer to just play casually and just button mash while positioning appropriately. I do have to point out though that servers can be janky at times, leading to some cheap deaths for myself and the opponent, and this exists for multiple regions, at least all the ones that I've tested it on. It seems like the kind of thing that will be fixed, but I think it bears mentioning as well. The game also gets bonus points for having a South African server. Number 7 is Cult of the Lamb. Despite its cutesy design, Cult of the Lamb has some rather disturbing imagery, depending on how squeamish you are around the idea of cults. You play as a little sheep managing and growing a cult of followers for a Cthulhu-style monster while slaying said monster's rivals and their followers. The game mechanics include things like sacrificing your followers, placing those with dissenting opinions in jail and re-educating them, eating the flesh of dead followers, resurrecting the dead. You get the idea. But presentation aside, it's a dungeon run game that mixes roguelite gameplay with a robust and pretty hefty base building system. Of those two, I'm a recent convert to roguelites, but I'm not a fan of base building, so I was pleasantly caught off guard with how enjoyable the balance of these two aspects was. While there's a myriad of mechanics to keep track of, it all gets easier with time, as many of the later upgrades are focused on auto management of the settlement, at which point the focus tends more towards battle and completing the 4 major dungeon areas in order to take on the rival monsters and basically complete the story. So outside of the grind required to get to a decent level, I think Cult of the Lamb is one of the strongest showings from the year. Number 6 is Stray. This is one of, I think, the most straightforward of the entries. You're a cat, you get stuck in this robot-filled sci-fi world, and then you go on an adventure to find your way out, dealing with light puzzles, light stealth, and a few very light fetch quests. It's also easily the shortest game on the list, though it does a decent amount with what little time it has. Easily the greatest aspect to the game is the visuals and animations surrounding the cat and the various locations you encounter, many of which lead to interesting questions around what happened to the world, and I guess there's little things you can do like scratching carpets and small cat related things like that. I was particularly impressed with the answers. I was not particularly impressed with the answers in the end, but it strikes me as being more about the journey than the destination with this one. I think the actual value of the game will come down to the discussion concerning its length, since I will admit there is not a lot of replayability, but on my scale, it did well enough with what it does to warrant recognition for that. Number 5 is Monster Hunter Rise. So, with a new wire bug feature for increased mobility, verticality and recovery mid-combat, a dog companion to cover distance even faster, smaller maps to reduce the time to find and engage monsters, a monster riding mechanic for major damage, it's clear that Monster Hunter Rise chose to focus on monster combat as compared to its predecessors' focus on exploration and tracking as the main aspects of the hunt. Unlike many sequels, this one seems to exist as supplementary to its predecessor rather than trying to replace it. Monster Hunter World remains the option for long encounters and hunts, while Rise provides basically an option for those that want quicker battles and less exploring overall, almost presenting itself as like a mobile option. While it's not as feature complete as World, which I also put a lot more time into than I did the new Rise, the formula this series runs with is still so strong that I foresee it being on the top 10, or at least considered within the best games of whichever year it's released in. I suspect the same thing will probably happen with the next releases as well. Number 4 is Plague Tale Requiem. I've made 2 previous videos about this one, so I'll just summarize. It's the most emotionally effective story that I played this year, with great performances from its actors, a great score, and the dark, hopeless world of this universe that still greatly contrasts with the hope that the lead characters struggle to keep despite their increasingly hopeless situation. Gameplay-wise, the sequel also expands on the enemy encounters, setting most of them in wider areas that allow for flexibility in the approach that you choose to take. I'm not sure where Asobo Studio go from here, as most of their other games were adaptation of movies, and then they had Microsoft's Flight Simulator game from 2020, so their experience seems to be wide and varied, but if they get a chance to do something of this nature again, I'll definitely be interested in seeing how they take that one on. Now, before I move on to the games of the year, let's go through some honorable mentions. Grounded was a fun survival experience, balancing adjustable survival difficulty with lots of exploration. The backyard setting is highly detailed as well, capturing and utilizing a lot of the items you'd expect to get lost within this kind of environment and factoring them into the game's mechanics. The creepy factor for some of the larger insects also makes for great tension as you help your shrunken character level up, starting with running from them to eventually fighting them with the right gear and facilities. As Dusk Falls was another great narrative experience, tackling a lot of mature subject matter and relying mostly on the voice actors' performances to carry the experience, since the art style is very limited and uses some sort of photo-based or comic book-based style of presentation. Honestly, I was not a big fan of that particular choice. If this was 7 years ago when I started this channel, it would have been on the list for sure, due to just the story and writing. Unfortunately, over the years, I've sort of soured a bit on these games that sell narrative and choices as their main and only appeal, mainly because they tend to sacrifice a lot of other gameplay elements to achieve this, and also because experiencing the various outcomes requires you to replay the game, or at least certain sections, which more often than not I find myself completely uninterested in doing. I had one playthrough of As Dusk Falls and got what is essentially the best ending. I don't really have any reason to want to go back and put these characters through worse outcomes just so I can see what that looks like. Honestly, I would have preferred this as a movie or a miniseries. The story is fine, it's great actually, but that just doesn't carry games for me on its own anymore. Rumbleverse was another game that I had way too much fun with, but I definitely would not consider it worth any awards. I just think it's a funny concept and a great time killer. So yeah, the entries don't all have to be deep. So let's now move on to the final 3. Number 3 is Vampire Survivors. It's bullet hell meets roguelite. Another unassuming game that, despite its looks, holds a lot of value. You only control your character's movement here and face wave after wave of incoming enemies with increasing sponginess and damage output, while you also try to level up fast to keep your own damage and defense ahead of the enemies. You can keep upgrades that make you stronger with each and every consecutive run. Each game starts out pretty simple, but as the random upgrades begin to pile up, the tension involved in staying ahead of the incoming damage sources while choosing the right upgrades to match correctly with those that you already have for maximum effect is basically where the game gets really good and can actually get quite addicting once you begin to figure out how all of this works. It's also one of those chill games that you can play while you listen to something else, a podcast, a video, or while you get through like a filler episode of whichever show you happen to be watching. This game also has been quite an important one in the industry. One of the reasons it's pretty high up. Since it's launched, we've had a long list of indie developers trying to mimic this formula and put their own spin on it. So basically this game kind of birthed a new genre when it came out, or at least popularized it. I'm not sure if something came out before this one. I'm yet to find one that's quite as tight as this one. I've tried a number of them, although there is one called Soul Survivors that's been getting a lot of love on Steam, so I look forward to trying that one out. Otherwise, like with the game itself, looks can be deceiving, and despite being quite underwhelming in its appearance, it's one of the stronger outputs of the year, and I will continue to play this one because of its high replayability and frequent updates. So, number 2 is Tunic. Now, the first and immediately observable thing about Tunic is that it has a bright, cute and friendly presentation. Contrary to that, however, this is actually one of the most hardcore games released this year. It has like a combination of old exploration style games like the old Zeldas, as well as Souls-like combat that requires you to look for the right opportunity to attack or dodge, and hack and simply spamming attacks is an easy way to get deleted here. This is a minimalist game as well. It gives little direction, mostly through visual hints, icons, and then a patchwork instruction manual whose pages you find scattered as you go about exploring. The game mostly requires you to use intuition, common sense, and curiosity to push yourself forward. Almost every time I got lost in this game, it turned out that I saw something that looked difficult and assumed that I must have missed some kind of upgrade that was supposed to get me there, only to realize that I just had to suck it up and actually make it through the challenge the first time, and then I get an upgrade to make it easier the next time. The game's key element is its figure-it-out approach to gameplay that can be equal parts rewarding and frustrating depending on how long it takes you to work out what needs to be done next. But the answer, surprisingly enough, is almost always available with a visual tell within sight or within the scribbles inside the instruction manual. So if you're up for a challenge in a small scale, brightly colored format with one of the most relaxing soundtracks around, this is definitely your choice. And of course, finally, number one is of course Elden Ring. I'm sure there's nothing unique or special about having Elden Ring in this position. I am confident most people will. The game speaks for itself for the most part. Multiple combat options, some of the most interesting if not disturbing character and enemy designs, interesting lore, fantastic boss battles with kick-ass music to accompany them. And that's before we even get into the changes that were made to the Dark Souls formula to appeal to a wider, more modern audience. Now, we've reached a time where that phrase actually usually indicates oncoming problems, but not in this case. From the inclusion of the horse, less backtracking, stakes of Marika to bring you closer to important fights, the ability to go off the beaten path and explore multiple locations, potentially out-leveling and out-gearing most of the game's content, not to mention the allowance of OP spells and weapons into the game, essentially makes this one of, if not the easiest of the Souls games that are out. And I will be upfront, these changes are the primary reason that I was able to get into this one. Essentially the generosity of the checkpoints, the ability to save and quit nearly everywhere, the addition of guard counters, jumping heavy attacks, all these things serve someone in my life situation very well, as I'm quite slow with combat reactions and I at times have to stop gaming in an instant due to work emergencies or other obligations, and so the ability to engage in short bursts while still making good progress is highly appreciated. That being said, this game also serves long sessions pretty well. I can't remember the number of times I completely lost track of time while playing the game due to just how engrossing it is once you're in there. I always thought I'd stop at the next checkpoint, but then there was always something off in the distance and I thought I'll just make it to that end point and then I can stop right there. But there's just so much hidden everywhere on the map that if you're not pacing yourself, you can easily get lost and just lose track of time. So this for me is without a doubt the most interesting digital world to explore this year, at least among those that I experienced. And as the game that I felt delivers the most when everything else is factored in, it's definitely what I feel is the strongest release for 2022. So yeah, those were my favorite games of the year. If you made it this far into the video or listening, leave a like and thanks for watching.